greetings. Welcome to the Dividing Line. Got a lot to get to today. It is, yes, it is sometime in March. Yeah, it looks like the 8th, Thursday, the 8th of March. There we go. Can you believe how far through 2018 we already are? No one's listening right now because you're either at the Licona conference or the Shepherd's conference. So this will all be listened to on archive, I would imagine. I'm not even sure why we're doing live feed. But for all of you sad people that didn't get to go, and all of you sad people that are wishing you had the Assault Bible, see, what happened this morning is someone tweeted from the Shepherd's Conference, because everybody at the Shepherd's Conference got this new Preacher's Bible, 5 pounds 7 ounces. Okay, now I've got an M500 50 caliber Magnum pistol. I mean, that thing is a beast. And when it's fully loaded, it's 5 pounds. This thing weighs more than an M500. Okay? I mean, I've seen some little preachers that would not be able to weigh. They go like this and fall straight back because it's way too heavy. Just break their arm off right there in the pulpit. It'd end up on Babylon Bee or something like that. The Roger Rabbit Bible. Yeah, that would be another comparison to it. Yeah. Anyway, they tweeted, I think Nick at the Shepherd's Conference tweeted a picture of a little teeny New American Standard and said, "This is my concealed carry." Because everyone else is lugging around this thing, which, you know, hey, I think it's really cool that someone just arrived, by the way, someone, Shepherd's Conference, wow, give those babies away. Congratulations. That's great. But so since they referred to a concealed carry New American Standard, then I referred to this new Preacher's Bible as the Assault Bible. You know, because we've got the assault weapons issue going on right now, and so I referred to it as the Assault Bible. And Phil Johnson ended up mentioning that from the pulpit. I hope no one took that wrong. But it is interesting that this is happening in California. I mean, Grace to You is distributing assault Bibles in California, and you cannot expect a certain level of waving at the studio audience here. You cannot expect a certain level of what we would call common sense in Sacramento. So I'm a little concerned about what may happen to the folks at Grace to You once the folks in Sacramento find out that they're distributing assault Bibles. You know, I have a feeling there could be, you know, legal ramifications very, very quickly so just better be careful. Just better be careful over there. So some folks have asked me, well, you know, are you going to get one? You know, and I was offered one very kindly. Appreciate that. And I declined only because I haven't preached from a paper Bible in a very long time. Now, I have nothing against paper Bibles. I love paper Bibles. I have an Allen New American Standard. And if you know the Allen brand, top level. Okay. And I love buying paper Bibles for other folks. And there's some great makers out there. Have you ever been to evangelicalbible.com? Oh, goodness. You can go pour there so fast. You could be out on the street, but have the best Bible around while you're out there. I hope it can keep you warm. But so I already have really, 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 really nice paper Bibles. I mean, look, you know, we've got, you know, our friend, you know, bound this one for me, and it's got I love the you know, the yap that sort of covers the whole thing, you know, and you know, this is a beautiful New American Standard here, you know, and so I have really nice paper Bibles. I don't preach from them, and the reason is I didn't bring it in here, but I have a 12.9-inch iPad Pro with fonts yay big. I can put that thing on the pulpit at PRBC. I could fall into the baptistry and still read my notes from the baptistry. Okay? I mean, that's how big it is. And if you are a speaker, then you know that when you do, and I don't move around as much at PRBC as I do at a lot of other places. We don't have a whole lot of acreage to move around up there anyways. But you've got to be able to find your place pretty quickly when you're getting back. And That iPad Pro is perfect for that. I mean, it's just, I even posted a screenshot of what my iPad looks like when I'm preaching from it. And so, you know, why take one from somebody else, you know? But I would imagine that at the end of this Shepherd's Conference, an enterprising, wise chiropractor should set up a booth right toward the end, because there's going to be a lot of crooked spines. Now, we could have a charismatic come along and heal crooked spines, but it actually is just be a waste of time. You should have a chiropractor go over there. And for, you know, all he had to do is charge, you know, small, he could make a killing, because everyone is going to be so out of place after dragging around that beast for as long as they're going to be dragging that beast around. So I called it the Assault Bible. That's what it's... yeah, Summer's listening, says, you could have given it to me. Sheesh. Well, I thought, dear, that I bought you a really nice Bible. I guess it wasn't as nice as the Assault Bible. So there goes my happiness. Anyway, the danger of watching your Twitter feed while you're doing the program. Anyway, I'm going to sort of stay on that theme for a second. A announcement was made just recently, and I mean just within like yesterday or the day before, that people have been asking me. I have said when the NA28, is this the NA28 or is this the NA27? This is the 27. No, 5. No, that's 27. So when NA28 came out, I said, you know, I wouldn't invest too much money because something tells me NA29 won't be too far down the road. Well, it's going to be a little bit down the road, but they just announced 2021, 2022, somewhere around that time frame for the next edition of the Nestle Aland text. So right now it's Nestle Aland 28th and UBS 5. So NA28 UBS 6 is due in 2021, 2022. And it's fascinating and frustrating for me, because the specific 2 books that they mention, which will have the greatest number of changes, Acts and Mark. So what that tells me is they're working on Mark. And that's the information I need for my P45 project. And it's not going to be available before I need to be done. And that's incredibly frustrating. And it is going to limit what I can do. What they mean by that is there is a, you know, so here's Nestle Aland 27th, 28th, same size. So this is a manual, critical edition of Greek New Testament. A lot of people look at this and they look at all the footnotes and they go, wow, that's a lot of information. But you got to understand, this is a super, super, super brief summary. Right now, they're working on what's called the ECM, Editio Critica Major. And that is Acts. Okay, came out a few months ago. That's Acts. And that's why they say Acts, because when NA28 came out, all the changes were in the general epistles and Revelation. Not Revelation, just general epistles. So small, relatively small amount of text. Then they came out with Acts. So it's there. So this is telling us that the next element that's going to come out will be Mark. And so the Nestle Aland and the United Bible Society's texts will reflect the changes that are made here. Now remember, if you're not familiar with a lot of this stuff, when we say changes, you know, I've given the example how here in the Nestle Aland 27th edition, in Jude 5, if I showed you Jude 5 in Nestle Aland, if I showed you Jude 5 in Nestle Aland 27th edition, this would say the Lord delivered a people from Egypt in Jude 5. The Nestle Aland 28 says Jesus. But what you'd see in here is while it would say Kurios in the main text, in the footnote, you're going to see Jesus and the manuscripts that it's in, so on and so forth. all that's happened in the 28th edition is the Jesus that was in the footnote is now in the main text. The Lord that was in the main text is now in the footnote. It's not like they just came up with something no one had ever seen before. I could have dragged in here my father's Nestle-Aland text from when he took Greek from Kenneth Wiest at Moody Bible Institute back in the 1950s. And I've got his Nestle-Aland. I think it's 23rd, if I recall correctly. 23rd or 25th. I think it's 23rd. Look down at the bottom of the page. There in the notes, Jesus. It's not like you can't make this stuff up. The text is got to be the text. So when they talk about changes, that's what they're talking about. So Acts introduced, again, Acts is a fairly decent-sized book. There weren't all that many quote-unquote changes, and what the changes are readings that used to be in footnotes are now in the main text, and readings that were in the main text are now in the footnotes. It's not like they've just decided to come up with new stuff. So if it's going to be Acts and Mark, that means the next big set that's going to come out in the ECM, which you can't carry this around very easily, that type of thing. Eventually, it will all be available electronically. Eventually, probably honestly toward the end of my life, or it's at least another 20 years, I would say, before that'll be fully available. And even then, and I'm not going to get into this right now. The temptation is great because it's what I'm working on. But even then, because most of these changes are based upon utilization of what's called CBGM, coherence-based genealogical method, as the databases being utilized by CBGM grow, they will immediately have to start a revision process. And that's I can just hear, because I was looking at something in Channel, and a traditional text, ecclesiastical text advocate was being quoted in Channel, and I can just hear those types of folks going, "Oh, such a naturalist," so on and so. Can't you just ever get the text in a final form? And that's tradition speaking. What we're talking about here is the wonderful. I mean, folks, if one radical Muslim group buys a bomb from North Korea, and if you don't think the North Koreans wouldn't sell it, you're nuts. That's the real danger with this whole mess. You could see so much of this progress not only in examination of the text of the New Testament and collation of manuscripts, stuff like that, but medical advancements, everything else. Man, the surface level of societal stability is very, very, very shallow. And all of that could come to a screeching halt. I mean, war and famine and stuff like that. Right now, we have the blessing of God in relative peace that allows this type of stuff to be pushing forward. But that could end tomorrow. So when I say 20 years from now, that's assuming that the Lord grants peace and the continuing ability to do these types of things. But it is a blessing to have this kind of information. It is not, as some people say, well, you can just never come to a final conclusion, blah, 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 blah. We are shedding more and more and more light. And I'm sorry, this traditionalism that you all want to promote cannot drag itself out of the very conservative Facebook forums that it thrives in and engage meaningfully in the marketplace of ideas. It really can't. And that's one of my major objections to it. So anyway, one of the things real quick that is really interesting is they also mentioned, remember I showed you the Tyndale House Greek New Testament? That Crossway, who else? Crossway put out. And I mentioned to you it's a little bit different because they will use variant spellings that were used in the ancient manuscripts rather than the way we standardize things today. And then the order of the epistles. So there's the end of Acts, and the next book is, James. it's a completely different order, and so the general epistles come before the Pauline epistles. So you go all the way through 3rd John, and then there's Jude, and what comes after Jude? Romans. And so the canonical order, it's not that they've put in new books or taken books out or anything like that, but the order is different. And what's interesting is NA29 might do the same thing, which will leave you thumbing through for a while going, where did Romans go? That type of thing. But they may do the same thing. And it makes me wonder why, which came first, chicken or the egg here? I mean, were there discussions that prompted both these to do that? Or is it because Tyndale House did that the guys in Munster go, that's not a bad idea? I don't know. But that's what they're talking about doing. So I do not believe there's anything inspired about the canonical order of books. That's why I've always repudiated the misapprehension of the words from the book of Revelation, taking out of the book of this prophecy. Well, it's the whole New Testament because this is the last book of the New Testament, so it's a whole thing. No, it's talking about Revelation. And to try to stretch it out beyond that is highly problematic. And the order of the books, we don't know the order they were written in. There is absolutely no foundation for trying to say, well, you've got to have it in this order. Even the Jewish people did not have the order that we have. The last canonical book of the Hebrew Old Testament is 2 Chronicles, which is why Jesus' statement that from the blood of Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, that's from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. In other words, the whole Old Testament canon. Anybody would have, if I said from Genesis to Revelation, same thing Jesus was saying as far as the Old Testament canon was concerned. But the order in which we have placed these books is primarily functional and somewhat arbitrary. So if they change that, as long as they do it for 2 or 3 editions in a row, after that, no one's going to care. The question is, what English translation is going to follow that? It would take a English translation with some bravery, because there would be. It's one thing if it's your Greek New Testament. Only geeks are worried too much about that, anyways. But you change your ESV, and all of a sudden James is no longer where James is supposed to be, and there's just going to be a lot of folks that are going to be jumping up and down and having try doing that. Try doing that with the with King James, and you'll have to hire extra security at your publishing house, because that's what's going to happen. Anyway, real quickly, I guess I'm going to do this just so that Rich doesn't have to waste much more of his time on this particular subject, but. Evidently, we've had folks who, during the program, in our YouTube channel, when we have comments open, which talk about inviting. I've always said the comm boxes are internet ignorance aggregators, and I've watched some of the comment channels on YouTube videos I was watching, and it was just astounding. Sadly astounding. I mean, absolutely destructive of post-millennial thinking. No, things ain't getting better. No, look at this mess. So evidently we had people there calling the office, had somebody in Twitter, doing the same thing. And I'm just demanding that I go on the air and send Billy Graham to hell. That's what I've got to do. I've got to go on the air and send Billy Graham to hell. Couple things. Most important thing is I don't have that power, right, ability, or position, and I am not stupid enough to pretend that I do. That is not my role. That is not my place. And the older I get and the more I see of the behavior of people, especially people who call themselves Christians on the internet, who absolutely think that your faithfulness is determined not by your identification of true teaching versus false teaching, but somehow by your ability to read the hearts and minds of men and determine who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. So in other words, somehow the internet has given us the ability to read minds from afar, to read hearts from afar, to see people's spiritual state from afar. Now, personally, I think that the best indicator we have in this life of a person's spiritual state can be sort of brought out by what Jesus said, he who endures to the end shall be saved. So in other words, there's this observation of a person's life over time. And sometimes, even then, what we see publicly is not what the reality is in private. We only see certain things. And today, oh my goodness, with the fake news and everything else, I mean, I see stuff these days. I see, I just saw, was it Moeller that mentioned it? Or somebody did. New editing capacity that can't even really be detected in, we all joke we all laugh at the Photoshopped pictures where you put your face on something, and people have done that to me over and over again, making memes of me and stuff like that. But you can always sort of tell. Evidently, they're coming up with ways of doing that where you can't. And it used to be, and I think it was Moeller now that I think about it, it used to be that visual evidence was considered to be that, here's a digital video of this guy, trying to break into this place that's X, Y, and Z. With this new technology, it doesn't even require, the wizards in Hollywood to put you in places you've never been, doing things you've never done. And I've mentioned briefly in the past that I think from a God's law perspective, you're supposed to be able to face your accusers. And they are supposed to swear before God, and they're supposed to face you, and so on and so forth. I'm just simply, I will not believe evidence brought against anyone that is electronic in nature anymore. I just won't. And I'll tell you why. We already know that there are people hacking into other people's systems. There are people who've already been brought up on charges where the government itself had gone into their computer systems. Hey, once you've got hold of my computer, anything on that, you can change anything. And I'd have no way on the earth of being able to refute it. And none of the rest of us, almost none of the rest of us would either. And so in this modern age of accusation and stuff like that, I think it's wisdom to be incredibly skeptical in light of fake news and everything that's going on, the ability to create falsehoods. Be skeptical. And the nicest thing as a Christian is, it's not my job anyways. We are never, the only context in which we are called to make any type of judgment close to that is when the local church engages in discipline. And of course, local church is not going to engage in discipline over the internet. I mean, the only people that you can discipline are the people who are members of your church. They are individuals that you know and that you live with and you can examine and you can all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that was a bit of a distraction from this issue of people absolutely demanding that I make a public statement condemning Billy Graham to hell. don't have the power, don't have the ability. What I can say is when you live 99 years in the public eye, that's a lot of talking and activity for people to be able to go through and to find things that they disagree with. Did I disagree with Billy Graham's eventual, not original, but eventual cooperation with Roman Catholicism and what seems like a fairly fully documented, not ecumenism in the sense of embracing Roman authority claims or sacramentalism or anything like that, but basically oversimplifying the demands of justification so as to work together with Roman Catholicism, of course. Very troubling. There is the clip from his conversation with Schuller that sounds like a rather blatant form of inclusivism that would not be consistent with earlier statements. Is that problematic? Certainly is. Once again, my position is you focus upon the teaching, you refute the teaching primarily positively first and foremost. In other words, the best way to refute a false teaching is not simply to say it's wrong here, here, and here, and here. What you first have to do is present what is true here, 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 and here, and then compare that with that teaching. That is edifying to others, that builds people up rather than just simply tearing down. There are a lot of people that think that polemics, apologetics, you tear down, you tear down, you tear down, and just assume that people know what the truth is, rather than taking those as opportunities to speak the truth about these things, attract God's people to that truth so that they can then see why they don't want to believe these things and why they shouldn't believe these things. But to do so with a focus upon the positive presentation rather than a negative presentation. That's our suggested way of approaching things. So the whole concept, I mean, you know, it does remind me a little bit of something that someone said recently. You know, all the criticism about, you know, how you go about evangelizing Muslims and so on and so forth. And someone put up a meme at one point that's been quoted a lot. I prefer James White's way of evangelizing Muslims to your way of not evangelizing Muslims. And in the same way, we can and must examine public invitation systems, utilization of emotional mechanisms to cause people to make a decision for Christ. Anyone like myself who's been in mega churches knows the results of all that. You have gone out on outreach visits and you've talked to people who walked the aisle, shook the hand, signed the card, and they now live a life of religious hypocrisy. They've been told that they have eternal security. They've been told that they're right with God because of what they did that one day, and they don't care about Christ. They don't care about his way. They haven't carried their cross across the room. They've never picked it up. And so you try to bring the word of God to bear to them, and they just don't care. They're religiously calloused. Is that a problem with the invitation system, the utilization of emotion, the minimalization of the gospel, the removal of the call to repentance and the full range of discipleship, and of course the embracing of the entire anti-lordship system of salvation, which is so deeply detrimental to a biblical understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ? All of that, completely true. Definitely. this is what troubles me, is that then people will go, aha, so that must mean Billy Graham is in hell. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. This isn't a biblical phrase, but I think it's a biblical truth. And it was first said to me by now my fellow elder, at that time just simply the pastor of the church I was looking at becoming a member of in 1989, I think. My fellow elder, Don Fry, is and I'm sure he didn't come up with it himself. In fact, I think he said, as someone has said. But I'll never forget when he said to me, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. And the reason I say it's a biblical truth is that every single preacher I know of, in some way, shape, or form, is a crooked stick. None of us have got it all figured out. None of us have a perfect balance. We've all got blind spots. And so if God couldn't draw a straight line with a crooked stick, he'd not be drawing any straight lines at all. And so once again, this, and it's, let's be honest, it's primarily amongst Calvinists, this desire to somehow utilize the death of Billy Graham to, I don't know what, just shock people? You know, just get people all, you what? What did you say? Shock people by saying, well, he's in hell because he preached a false gospel. Well, I remember back in the 70s listening to Billy Graham crusades, and I heard a lot about repentance and faith toward Jesus Christ. I heard a lot about the doctrine of sin. I heard a lot of gospel. And today, would I do things the way that Billy Graham did them? Probably not. But once again, you just have to, you know, I sometimes worry about people that are sitting around on their computers who probably probably think that posting memes on Facebook is the same thing as evangelism, who have some type of a personal vested interest in condemning Billy Graham to hell, rather than going, you know, I'm thankful, because I know people that will say, I was saved at a Billy Graham crusade. I know Calvinists who will say, God used Billy Graham to expose me to the gospel. I've learned more about the gospel and a proper balance to the gospel since then, but that's what God used. He used a crooked stick to draw a straight line of what it meant to believe in Jesus. And if we believe the Holy Spirit's the one that applies specifically the truth of God to our hearts to bring about regeneration, are you going to say that it requires an absolutely perfect presentation of that? Or can the Holy Spirit use whatever he chooses to use to bring about a person's regeneration? There's this vested interest, this need to, instead of be focused upon, you know, we have a better way. We have a way that's more glorifying to God. We have a way that puts fewer impediments in the way of the Holy Spirit. We shouldn't want to force the Holy Spirit to use a crooked stick. But there's a vast difference between wanting to make sure that our message is straight and is in perfect accordance with the Bible, and then never actually announcing it and never actually proclaiming it. And when someone else is proclaiming the gospel, all we can do is stand back and condemn them and criticize them, rather than coming alongside, maybe even being encouraged by their zeal, but then in grace showing them a better way. Oh, we can't do that. No, can't. No. That's can't do that. So for all of you that want me to take the role, according to John chapter 5, which I was just preaching recently, all judgment has been given to the Son. I ain't taking his place. And if you think you can, Shame on you. I don't want to stand before the judgment as you. I say this to my fellow Calvinists. Recognize where there were problems. Deal with those problems positively. But stop being the Holy Spirit. Stop being the Son of God. You are not equipped for either one. And you don't want to ever have to be accountable to that. Next, real quick. I mentioned last week that we were going to start looking at some teachings from the Christ in Me group. But I only have the one audio file, and I have not been able to edit it yet to be able to start getting into it and start looking at... well, I only have the second part of an audio file. For some reason, I don't even know how I got it. This is so weird. I've got so much stuff going on that I don't even remember how I got this. And it's the second half of a video that I've seen, and I want to actually deal with the audio part that came just before in the video with the audio that I have, because it was a very interesting, I think it's important to understand, attempt to distinguish between Jesus and the Christ. This is what this group is doing. For those of you who don't remember or weren't here when I mentioned this, there's a new cult group developing in South Africa. And it is fascinating to be able to watch the genesis of a cult group in the modern era. And they've only been around for 4.5 years. And their theology is still evolving and changing. I sat down a year ago at Northwest with a fellow PhD student in the School of Theology there. And that's the group he's working on. And I said, dude, this is going to be a little tough because you put down what they are teaching now, and a year from now it's going to be different. And I was right. It is. And so that makes it real challenging, still well worth pursuing just to document the evolution. Well, one of their teachings is that there is a difference between Jesus and the Christ. The Christ Spirit can dwell in all of us. We have this logos, this message that we are to bring to the world, so on and so forth. And Jesus just happened to be one of those who bore this word. And so they go to Isaiah 9:6. This was their Christmas presentation. They go to Isaiah 9:6, and they try to make that distinction by saying, unto us a child is born. That's Jesus. Unto us a son is given. That's the Christ. And so I want to be able to play that and then go into the Hebrew and demonstrate that's absurd, because it is. But I don't have it yet. So I'm not putting it off. Like I say, I'm not going to do it or something like that. I just need to have all the materials that I need to be able to put that together, and it takes a long time that I haven't been able to get to it. So we will get to that as time allows. So, wow, there's a lot of stuff already that we've covered. The only way we could make it even wider is if we open the phones, and we're not going to do that because I need to get back to the Bart Ehrman, Michael Licona debate. Stop looking at Twitter. You're never gonna get to this. That's thankfully it's at least when I'm on this camera, it's over there. When I'm at this camera, I can sort of glance down at it and see it a whole lot easier. And so it's probably best for concentration to stay over here. For those who weren't with us on the last program, a debate took place a couple weeks ago. Another debate. There have been a number of them. Between Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona. Even Bart mentioned in this debate, his favorite debate with Mike Licona was the debate where Mike Licona had laryngitis and could hardly say a word, and therefore, as Bart Ehrman said, I beat him speechless. Well, that's true. It was rough to try to listen to Mike Licona talk like this. It was very, very difficult. I felt very bad for him. I forgot how many years ago it was, but that was a very, very, very tough situation. But anyways, there have been a number of debates they've done. And we have, as carefully and accurately as we have been able to do so, more than once attempted to delineate and to explain the differences in apologetic methodology between how Mike Licona will debate Bart Ehrman, or William Lane Craig will debate Bart Ehrman, or anyone in that evidentialist camp, and how someone such as myself would debate Bart Ehrman, depending on the topic and what the issues are. And I started an introduction last time because this is a huge, huge area, and I think it's vitally important. And I'm sorry, I know there are some people who feel like, we just need to leave that stuff to you professionals. But the problem is, that's the attitude that has resulted in the massively high rate of deconversion of our young people when they go to university. You can't leave it to the professionals. This stuff is going into the brains of our young people straight through this. And you can't hide this. You can't hide from this. You can't live in a cave anymore if you're going to be engaged in proclaiming the gospel in our society. If you want to start a convent or something, a monastery out in the mountains, and put up cell dampening towers, I suppose you could do that, but we've all seen how that works historically. And so we have to be dealing with these issues, and it needs to be the whole body of Christ, not just the specialists. As I've said, my grandparents' generation didn't have to deal with alleged contradictions in the synoptic gospels on the level that we have to today. But it's not just the Bart Ehrmans. The Bart Ehrmans are, the Muslims borrow all of Bart Ehrman's stuff. I've mentioned when I debated one Muslim at Duke University years ago, 3 of the 4 books he had on his desk were by Bart Ehrman. And so it's not only religious people that will utilize this information, but the agnostic, the atheist, so on and so forth. And it raises, I think, vitally important subjects that should be a normal part of our conversation. I'm a little concerned, to be honest with you, that most Christians can carry a Bible around, even really big Bibles, heavy Bibles, and never think about asking the question, why are there differences between the Gospels? Now, I realize the reason for most is that you read the Gospels concurrently. They sort of sounded alike. You really didn't think much about it, but you can't duck those issues anymore. Bart Ehrman pretends that he's introducing us to something we've never thought about doing before. And he says, well, the way you need to study the Gospels, you need to study them in parallel columns. Well, who invented that? The Christians did. I mean, go back to Origen's Hexapla and stuff like, we've been doing that stuff forever and a day. Down there, don't worry about it. It's down there is won't worry about it, is my synopsis of the Gospels, published by Christians. I've mentioned a billion times before. Oh, stop that. You can't see it anyways. I'm hiding it. 9 years teaching through the synoptic gospels using a parallel where you can't dodge the differences that exist between them. We've been doing this for a long time. And yeah, it can be uncomfortable to people. I mean, Ehrman brings up the standard list, and there are tough things to deal with. Very tough things to deal with. Trying to harmonize in a fair, historical, textual, consistent fashion the birth narratives, the resurrection narratives. It's not easy to do. And there are people in the church that will just honestly tell you, I don't want to think about that stuff. I just want to come to church and read my Bible, and I just don't want to think about any of that kind of stuff. Well, I'm afraid the day when you could have that kind of easy, relaxing Christianity has passed us. Maybe back in the 30s or 40s or something, you could have gotten away with that. Not so much anymore. And so we started looking at an example, and I didn't get it done. I didn't finish it off. And so I need to do that And so I'm actually going to back up here, and I am going to pick up the speed of Ehrman's comments. So I'll play them at 1.2 so we can get a little bit done a little bit faster. But here is what we looked at last time on the program.
The gospel writers want to emphasize different things. And the problem with thinking that they're all accurate is that it means that you read one of the Gospels as if it's saying the same thing as another one of the Gospels, when in fact they might be emphasizing different things based on the different stories that they've heard. Okay, so,
he talks so fast. I'm going to go back to just normal speed. We talked about this last time. We saw the presuppositional nature of Barth's argument, specifically that they can't be accurate if they have different emphases. And we point out examples of why this is just simply an incoherent position to take. It's a presuppositional assumption of the error of the text that you're examining. It's unfair. But there it is in his own words. And now he's going to give the example. And he has used this example many times before. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this first, rather than just starting at the beginning of his presentation, or actually spending some time looking at a couple of points in Mike Licona's presentation, because there's good things that he has to say. He says good things. We have fundamental disagreements on certain things, which means we're going to end up emphasizing things differently, but he says good things. And then going through Barth's presentation, I'm trying to sort of give you an example ahead of time, an overarching theme, in essence, of what you're going to see if you take the time to listen carefully to what Bart Ehrman is saying here. And I sort of feel if you can come to the point where you are comfortable hearing his objections and knowing what the answers are, you're going to be pretty comfortable with what anybody's throwing out at you, as long as you can recognize the different emphases and identify the presuppositional differences as to where they're coming from, stuff like that. And so here's the example he gives. And I realize there a very small number of people in the audience may remember that 2 or 3 years ago, I think coming up 3 years ago this summer, I did a series of sermons at PRBC on the deity of Christ in the Gospel of Mark. And the whole reason I did it was so that we could address this very kind of issue, because it's so common. And those of you who go all the way back to, what was it, 2008? Was it 2008 when we had the debate with John Dominic Crossan in Seattle? I think it was 2008 was the time frame for that. Michael Fallon would remember exactly, but no, it wasn't 04. It's too early. 2008, I think. Anyway, we had the debate with John Dominic Crossan. This came up in the Crossan debate as well, so it's not the first time we've been addressing it. But once again, listen to the skill that Bart Ehrman has developed in presenting this kind of argument. And put yourself in the position of having to answer this argument before I answer the argument. What? 2005? Wow, okay. 2005. So that was a long time ago with John Dominic Crossan. All right, here's his example. Let's listen in.
Here's the example. It has to do with Jesus' demeanor going to his death. What was Jesus' demeanor going to his death? How was he approaching his own death? In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, and he's silent. Pilate can't understand why he's silent. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says only 2 words, "Su leges." You say so. That's all he says. He's taken off to be crucified and doesn't say anything on the road to crucifixion. He's silent the entire way. He's nailed to the cross, and he's silent the entire time. Both of the people being crucified with him, both of the robbers being crucified with him, both of them mock him in Mark's Gospel. And Jesus is silent, doesn't say anything. You wonder what is going on here. Why is Jesus so silent? It's as if he's in shock. And at the end, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus says the only time in the entire proceeding, at the end, he finally cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. That's it. It is the most amazing account, gripping in its pathos, of a man who at the end feels forsaken by God himself and dies on the cross. As Mike has pointed out, Mark was one of the sources for Luke. Luke also tells an account of Jesus going to his death, basing his account on Mark, but changing it in places. And the changes he makes are significant.
Okay, so there's presentation. What he's going to go on from that to say is, okay, Luke, Jesus says all these things at the trial. He has conversations with people as he's going to the cross. He says stuff from the cross. Matthew, same thing, different things. John, totally in control. And the point is, Mark has Jesus as the abandoned, out of control, you've left me, everyone's left me. That's Mark's point. Matthew says something that's contradictory. Luke says something that's contradictory. John even more contradictory than the other three. They're all in contradiction with each other. That's the argumentation. And he says that there's the example. The example. So how would you respond to that? How would you answer that assertion? Well, a lot of Christians struggle because they haven't thought through the things we talked about last time. The fact that each of the gospel authors has to be allowed to the freedom to choose what they do and do not include in their narratives based on how long they want their gospel to be, how much room they think they're going to be able to have, the context in which they think that gospel is going to be presented. If you write a book and your assumption is that you have to put everything you need to communicate to someone in the book, there's not going to be an external context that's going to be able to add to what's in the book. That's going to be a different book than a book that you write to be used in the context of the proclamation and teaching of a group that's going to provide the rest of the message. So if Mark assumes that his gospel is going to be read within the context of the oral proclamation of the gospel, he doesn't have to be as exhaustive as someone who makes the choice to try to get it all into one package. And so if Mark, for example, that might theoretically be relevant to the longer ending of Mark and whether there is a longer ending of Mark, so on and so forth. Why could Mark have ended his gospel at Mark 16:8 with the women who were afraid? Well, if he expected it to be read within the context of the eyewitnesses, that would be a perfect time for the eyewitnesses to give their own testimony of the risen Christ. And so there could have been a context that makes sense in the early church that would explain these things. So a lot of people have not thought through why there would be length differences, why there would be focus differences, why does Mark focus upon these things, and Matthew's obviously focusing upon primarily Jewish things, and Luke seems to have a real interest in including women and their intersection with Jesus and their issues, and seemingly he had interviewed a number of them, and that's how they have that position. And John's coming seemingly after all the others, and possibly after almost all the original witnesses are gone, and so he can have the freedom to address things that they wouldn't have had the freedom to address. All these things should be taken into consideration. And it's interesting, Ehrman won't allow it because he has a particular theory of the early church, and he really doesn't allow for any other perspective than his own. Fundamentalists do the same thing. The fundamentalist struggles with these things, and that's where, Bart Ehrman loves to say, well, there are some Christians that say that, the reason for this is that, Peter, and how many times, Peter's denials and the cock crows and stuff like that. And I've met people that actually said that Peter denied Christ 6 times. And because they're trying to harmonize Matthew and Luke. So they just put them all together, and I just believe whatever Matthew says, I believe whatever Luke says. There were 6 denials and blah, 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 blah. And it's real easy to mock that kind of an attitude. The irony is, I'm not sure that Bart really recognizes that he still has a fundamentalist attitude himself, because that's what he was raised in. He went to Moody Bible Institute, so he still thinks along those lines. He's dismissed it, and hence won't listen to anybody that even smacks in his thinking as being, quote unquote, a fundamentalist. But to hear that kind of an argument is going to require you to have some knowledge of the Gospel of Mark yourself. And when we go to the Gospel of Mark, there are numerous indications of the fact that this is not what Mark is intending to communicate at all. For example, shortly before his betrayal, you have the anointing that takes place. And you remember the disciples are scandalized that such an expensive alabaster box is broken and so on and so forth. And this anointing takes place. What does Jesus say in the Gospel of Mark? He says, she has anointed this for what? For my burial. For my burial. Jesus knows what's coming. He says it's necessary for the Son of Man to go. This isn't some person that just gets caught up in the whirlwind of politics at Passover under the Roman rule and just finds himself amazingly abandoned and alone on the cross. He goes there for a purpose. He says that he is going to suffer these things. He makes the prophecy. He talks about the anointing as being for his burial. And isn't it fascinating that while he says, well, before Pilate, he's silent, but Jesus wasn't silent in Mark. Remember, he is in the one context that he tells us about. But why wouldn't you tell us the whole story that is found in these words, beginning at, verse 55 of chapter 14. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. Now it is fascinating to me, by the way, just in passing, to recognize that the clearest explication of those words is found in the Gospel of John, not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you have, even here, a testimony to the fact that the gospel writers are not giving you everything, and then John fills things in at a later point in time, which is exactly what you would expect. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, not just you say, and Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? They all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. And so here in Mark, in the primitive gospel, which we'll see later on, Ehrman's going to argue Only in John do you have Jesus making explicit statements of deity. Yeah, except for here in Mark 14, where he conflates Psalm 110 with Daniel 7, both of which were texts that the Jews of that day fully understood had to do with divine beings at the very least. I mean, obviously, intertestamental Judaism has a wide variety of interpretive methodologies and mythologies and everything else going on. But both of those texts, well known, Psalm 110, the most cited text from the Old Testament in the New Testament. And one of the reasons maybe Ehrman has this really weird off-the-wall theory that Jesus isn't the Son of Man, that Jesus is talking about somebody else, some eschatological figure, but it's not him, which is really weird. But Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and come with clouds of heaven. And his interpreters have no problem with what he's saying. They understand it is blasphemy. They tear their clothes. We don't need any more testimony. You've heard the blasphemy is deserving of death. How can you pretend that you are in any way, shape, or form accurately representing Mark's intention in presenting the attitude of Jesus at the crucifixion and skip that? How do you do that? How does that work? That makes no sense to me. It is misrepresentational. And so you have in Mark the prophecies, the determination of the Son of Man to go to the cross. You have Jesus' citation of Old Testament passages indicating his own recognition of who he is right in the text. And you can go earlier in Mark. Like I said, I did a whole series on the deity of Christ in the Gospel of Mark. And all of that skipped so that you can create a narrative filled with pathos. A narrative filled. And the only thing, he says, that Jesus says from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Which, of course, is chapter 15, verse 34 of the Gospel of Mark. And we are told, well, here, Jesus, right as his death, he feels abandoned and he doesn't know what's going on. And so he's going to make this a contrast to then Luke, Matthew, John, the whole idea, read these things. And you heard him say right there at the end, now Luke uses Mark. Well, if Luke uses Mark, and then presents a completely different view of Jesus at the end, then what do you have to conclude? That there is no way to harmonize these things, that these men were deceptively willing to fundamentally change the message of the text that they were dealing with. That's what he wants to communicate to you. That is the issue. And so even though Luke has in front of him in Mark, according to this theory, all of these indications, Luke's going to come up with something else. He's going to contradict the story. That's what he wants you to hear. That's what he wants everyone to walk out of that hall that evening believing. I can't trust what these men said. They're not eyewitnesses. They weren't there, and they've changed the stories. And once you get to that point, there's no reason for you to believe in Orthodox Christian faith. You might as well abandon it, which is what he wants. He says, I'm not interested in anyone's deconversion. I'm sorry. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Now, how many times have we heard our Muslim friends make the same argument? Now, for a different reason. They're not trying to create a pathos-filled narrative of Jesus being out of control. The Muslim idea is that the citation of Psalm 22 in Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is a statement of unbelief on Jesus' part. And that therefore Jesus could never have said that. Or if you believe he said that, then you are denigrating a prophet of God, or the Christian Jesus is a coward. I've heard that one said too, a number of times. So it's different motivation, but it's the same thing. Jesus feels abandoned, but God doesn't abandon faithful people, and so on and so forth. So when I first heard Ehrman say this, I'm just like, because any of you who watched the program only a matter of weeks ago with Michael Brown, where we walked through Psalm 22, know what Psalm 22 is about. You know it's deeply messianic character, it's prophetic character, and you know that it was one of the songs of the people of God. Therefore, to quote the first few words was to bring the entire psalm to mind amongst the people. I mean, I can say to anyone today, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I don't have to quote the rest of it. You know what I'm referring to. If you haven't memorized it, you can certainly go find it easily enough. And much more so was that the case amongst the Jews. So to quote the first line of Psalm 22 and then ignore what the rest of Psalm 22 is about is absurd. It's not contextual reading. It's not scholarly reading by any stretch of the imagination. And so as soon as I heard this, while I was listening to this initially, I'm like, oh, that is just so easy to refute when you quote from the trial of Jesus, where he identifies himself as the Son of Man and being presented before the Ancient of Days, and he has people that worship him and stuff like that. And when you contextualize Psalm 22 properly and the vindication of the servant, and oh man, that starts sounding too much like Matthew and Luke. So we can't have that because we already have our minds made up, as Bart Ehrman does. He has invested his entire scholarly career and his spiritual life into this narrative. And then turns around and says, we're the biased ones. And the world accepts that, because as long as you're an unbeliever, you can't be biased. Only the believers can be biased, not recognizing he's a believer in a different worldview that he has a lot of investment in. And so I'm sitting here going, well, boy, I'm going to use this as an example. I'm going to mark this, and someone in channel just said, I wonder if Dr. Ehrman is listening. I can guarantee you he is not. He has no interest, that much interest, in what anyone says in response to him. None. He could care less what I have to say. Remember when we debated? When I debated Bart Ehrman in 2009, he used the same PowerPoint presentation he had used the year before with Dan Wallace that still had the same misspelled words and problems in the PowerPoint presentation. He hadn't even edited it. He hadn't Googled a thing I had ever written. He didn't care. He simply did not care. So no, he's not listening. He does not have any vested interest in what the other side has to say. So I was sitting there going, I'm gonna use as an example, and you get into the Q&A. And I'm sitting here remembering where I was in my ride at this point, and I was. I had to actually go back, and my iPod, on the iPod thing, it has the go back 30 seconds, because I was going downhill when this question started. At about 32 miles per hour, the wind is quite loud, and I'm sitting here going, and I'm trying to watch traffic and stuff like that. And so I had to go back later on and to catch it. And lo and behold, during the Q&A, an audience member caught him on this. And it turns out, Bart Ehrman's a bright guy. He's well read. He well knew about the Psalm 22 issue. Listen to the level of this response that Bart Ehrman gives on this subject.
In your comparison between the two accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, you said in one of them he felt forsaken by the Father by crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But did you consider that Psalms 22 starts out with that, and given that he was a rabbi, or considered a rabbi by most people, he, by the end of Psalms 22, is saying how it would be, people would be praising God rather than feeling forsaken. Why would you come to the conclusion for?
Yeah, great question. So the cry of dereliction, as it's called, is often interpreted that way, that he's quoting the first part of the psalm, but he wants you to think about the end of the psalm. And so at the end of the psalm, God intervenes and God's on his side, and so he feels confident in God, and he expresses that confidence at the end of the... And I don't agree with that reading of it. Of course, that's a common reading of it. I know about the reading, but I think that it misunderstands what Mark is trying to say. Because I think if Mark wanted to say that Jesus was feeling confident in God, he would have quoted a different part of the psalm.
We're talking the leading English-speaking critic of New Testament Christianity, and his argument is, I think that Mark was trying to communicate that Jesus had been abandoned by God. So in light of that, I just can't believe that's why he's quoting. Now, he would have quoted a different part of the psalm. Have you read Psalm 22 recently, Dr. Ehrman? I'm sure you have. They parted my garments, cast lots, pierced my hands through, they wag at me, they wag their head at me. I mean, it's like the psalmist is standing there watching a crucifixion which hadn't been invented yet. Now, I'm sure that bothers you because as a naturalist, you can't believe in prophetic stuff. It's a supernatural text. But this is, without question, one of the most messianic, prophetic texts that's describing exactly what Jesus is going through right now, and Mark would have quoted something else. How do you start off directing someone to a psalm? How would the Jews have identified a particular psalm? By its beginning, just as we do today. That is one of the weakest. I mean, I'm used to, I've done more debates than Bart Ehrman has. I'm used to listening to people's voices, and what I'm hearing in that voice is, yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that one. Yeah, that's a pretty strong argument against my entire construction. And this was the example. He even emphasized the word "the." This was the example that he wanted to give. And so when I heard this, I was just like, I knew he knew what this was. He even says, yeah, that is the majority reading. Sure is. Of anybody who's going to allow for the slim possibility that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, fully recognizing that we need to look at the different emphases that were there, will not accept the idea that that means that they're lying. That you can have people that can take one core of historical reality and narrate it in 4 different accurate fashions. That is the one thing that cannot be allowed on the scholarly table in today's analysis. And I've said it before, if you are going to be a bold and confident witness in this day of unbelief, you must demythologize scholarship. You must get past this idea that just because somebody has a bunch of letters after their name, that means that somehow you cannot challenge their presuppositional errors of thought. You've got to get past that. They may know more facts than you do. Bart Ehrman knows a lot of facts. Remember in our debate, I've used an example a billion times. In our debate during the Q&A, this well-meaning Christian guy gets up, older fella, and he throws the Isaiah scroll softball. The Isaiah scroll softball. How can you say there's been all these changes when they find the Isaiah scroll from Qumran? It's 1,000 years earlier than what we had in the Masoretic text, and yet it's the exact same thing. And now we'd have the Leviticus scroll softball. You know, just within the past, 6 months? 8 months ago was when the story came out about the Leviticus scroll they found, which they could not unroll because of its condition, but they used X-ray to be able to read the inside of the scroll. It's fascinating. It's great. They've done it since then. This is going to help us. And you know, it's great to live in a day like this. It's wonderful when this type of technology is available. But they're softballs. And I knew that Bart Ehrman was just bringing the bat back, ready to knock it right out of the park. And there's absolutely nothing I could do about it because it's audience Q&A. Because if you're going to make that argument, then you need to have also thought through, why is it that the Greek Septuagint version of Jeremiah is 1/3 shorter than the Masoretic version of Jeremiah? Now, there is actually an answer to that within the text of the the prophecy of Jeremiah, because he mentions the fact that the initial copy of his book was, they took it from him and tore it up in front of him. What if there had already been copies of that? What if that started a line of transmission and then he redid it with the additional things later on, and now there's 2 different lines of transmission of 2 different... It's even mentioned in the book, but you have to be aware of that. He knows these things. He's well aware of them. But I'm sorry, I just have to present that as an example of a abuse of the information. It is very evident to me that Dr. Ehrman has very little respect for people who have any type of conservative belief. And so I just don't think he thinks it's much of it. He can go ahead and misrepresent us. That's why when he talks about harmonization of texts, he always presents the worst possible silly examples of it rather than sober and serious scholarly examples that he knows about. He's well aware of them. He just doesn't want to deal with them. He'll give the worst examples rather than the best. And that is highly problematic. Highly problematic. All right. I've got just enough time to give you another example here real quick. This is from Mike Licona's presentation. Now, I am going to pick this up to 1.2. And you'll see why in just a second. Here, let's just listen to this from Mike Licona's presentation.
Now, unlike modern pastors who have to prepare a new sermon every week, Jesus was an itinerant preacher. And so he was traveling and speaking to new audiences all the time. So perhaps he had a dozen or so sermons. And he preached these same sermons over and 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 over. And then he told his disciples who had heard him preach this, he said, now I want you guys to go out and preach the same things. And I send you out by twos. They could go out, they could correct one another. And so they went out and they taught the same things they had heard countless times. They taught it over and 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 over. And then they returned and Jesus debriefed them. And then he showed them how to adapt some of those teachings. Hey, when you're speaking to a Gentile audience, you can tweak this parable a little bit from what you do with a Jewish audience, and so forth. And so he illustrated this, and he showed them again the same teachings over and 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 over. And then, of course, he's crucified, rises from the dead, commissions his disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations. And now, for the next several decades, they preach the same things. Over and over, and you get the idea, right? Perhaps thousands of times. So Jesus' messages, his teachings, weren't something that he spoke of just once, and then his disciples had to recall decades later.
Now, okay, I'm watching the channel. The channel's going crazy. They're typing over and over and over. YouTube doing the same thing. I was watching our studio audience, which, by the way, our studio audience today is much prettier to look at than it normally is.
Unfortunately, I have to look at you. Somebody in YouTube wants to know who...
It goes both ways, folks.
Who Randover is.
Randover? And
yes,
Randover,
they want to know who Randover is.
I was just leaving Bartlett Lake when he started that. I was climbing. It's steep at that first part, and I almost wanted to drive off into a cactus. But he was making a point, and we'll never forget it, will we? I had never heard anyone repeat the word that often in my life, but there was a reason for it. You'll never forget it, right? And it is something to think about. There is an element of truth to be considered. And that is, we have a tiny little portion of the preaching of Jesus. And especially when you look at the grand themes of the kingdom, when you compare parables between the synoptic gospels, mainly Matthew and Luke, we do need to avoid the idea that Jesus told this story one time. It is highly unlikely that that's the case. He probably told those stories repeatedly, and he wouldn't have told them the same way every single time. And so when you go, well, Mark has this, and Matthew has that, and Luke has that, yeah, so? I mean, if Jesus' ministry was 3 years long, do you have any idea how big the transcript of his teaching would be? I mean, think about John chapter 5. He's teaching all day long. I mean, the whole day. Hours and hours on end. If you transcribed all of that, it'd be huge. We have this much of it. And his point is that what Ehrman does is Ehrman says, hey, okay, how many of you remember what Barack Obama said in his State of the Union address in 2016? That was just a couple years ago. And I don't remember what he said. You don't remember either. And you're telling me people remembered 50 years later exactly what Jesus said? So what is Licona doing? Well, he is sort of presuppositionally heading off a common objection by saying, well, what they record was either personal conversations they themselves had, which if you had a personal conversation with Barack Obama, you probably would remember what you said. Or the things that not only had they heard Jesus say over and over again, but then when they went out and preached, they had repeated these things over and over and over again in the presence of other people who had also heard these things. So if you start, innovating and going off the rails, and somebody else will say, wait a minute, we both heard that one lots of times, and he didn't add that little embellishment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that the oral mechanism of this teaching provided some of its own self-correction. And that the perspective that Ehrman gives, that this was a story repeated, like telephone. The old, I guess outside the United States, it's called Chinese whispers. That sounds extremely politically incorrect to me. But anyways, it's called Chinese whispers, where you whisper the thing around the circle, and when it comes out the other end, it has nothing to do with what it originally started, or is perverted in rather silly ways. That's Ehrman's presentation. And so what he's telling you is these gospel writers, they're not in Palestine, they're not eyewitnesses, they're writing decades later, and they're at the end of a long, unreliable string of oral teaching. And that's why there's all these differences. And there's no way to get back to the original. No one could ever know. There's no foundation for Christianity. That's basically what his argument is. And what's interesting is when Ehrman responded to this, all he said was, where does the Bible say he repeated these things? In fact, that almost sounded like him, didn't it? I almost did a good, that was a fairly decent Bart Ehrman. I'm not much of an impersonator. My son's good at impersonations. I don't know where he got that from because my wife's doesn't do impersonations and I don't do impersonations.
Much better than your British.
Did you hit your so they heard that. Okay. All right. Do you see what I put up with? I get all the time about how mean I am to Rich, but you don't know what it's like around here. You just don't know. It's terrible.
I mean, if it's true.
Anyway, yeah. So, anyway, what was I saying? Moses was in the bulrushes, and what's that? So, his response is to go fundamentalist. Where does the Bible say that? It's like, well, wait a minute. He wasn't saying that Licona wasn't saying there's a Bible verse that says that Jesus repeated so on and so forth. What he's doing is he's observing the nature of the evidence itself, which are the four Gospels. Well, and even in the early church. I think Paul's epistles give testimony to this as well. And drawing a very logical and rational and truthful conclusion that we do not have an exhaustive list of sermons from Jesus. And if the apostles felt that what they gave in the Gospels was an accurate summary of Jesus' teaching, then that must mean that this was pretty much what Jesus was teaching for the course of 3 years, which means he repeated it over and over and over again to different audiences. So I found his response really disingenuous and rather unscholarly at that point regarding that. So I had a couple other things queued up here that I found rather interesting, but we'll get to them as we go through the presentation. But can you see how a meaningful analysis of the arguments here has application way beyond just the formerly religious skeptical guy? This has application to a wide variety of apologetic arguments. And I wish we didn't have to deal with stuff like this, but this is the age to which we have been called to minister. And that means we've got to do a lot more work. Other generations had to do work in other areas. You look at the early church dealing with their situation. They had to focus upon things we don't have to focus upon. Well, this is where we are. It's what we got to deal with. So hopefully that is useful to you. We will continue with that and so much more on the next edition of The Dividing Line, Lord willing. And I don't fall off a mountain this weekend, because I am going to be riding down one fairly quickly. So if the Lord is good, we'll be back next week, and we'll see you then. God bless.